Welcome to the ChroniFI podcast. I am here with Patrick DePeters, who I met about a month ago and has since become a friend. And one of the things that really stood out about Patrick is the fact that he was very good about instilling discipline and accountability in his early career life. So we'll get into that later. Basically, Patrick has gone from being an investment banker to now a founder and CEO of a company. And so similar sort of journeys, and I'm looking forward to sharing the wisdom that Patrick has to share. Patrick, thanks for coming on the show.
Ben, thanks so much for having me. It's a privilege getting to know you and to being on your show. So thank you again for having me on.
The feeling is definitely mutual there. So where the similarities kind of begin for us is that straight out of college, we were both entering the kind of investment banking world. I'd love to hear how you looked at investment banking when you started out. It was Mitsubishi, right?
Yep, MUFG. So Mitsubishi Financial Group, which is one of the top 5 biggest banks in the world. A lot of people in the U.S. might not be familiar with it, but it's like one of the biggest banks internationally, but especially in Japan.
Got it. And what was that like for you working there? How long were you there? What was it like to start, and what was the progression like?
Yeah, it was really interesting, I think, in part because it was an interesting time to be in finance in general. So I graduated from the University of Richmond in 2010. Which meant that I started the sort of the Wall Street track basically in 2006, 2007, before the financial crisis. And so prior to that time, the route to Wall Street was very well trodden, and it didn't really have a lot of baggage. So it just seemed like for someone like me interested in economics and business and maybe entrepreneurship, it was the thing that sort of everyone was doing. But obviously the crisis happened of 2008, and I think that threw a big monkey wrench in a lot of people's plans, and it made the industry a little bit more kind of fragile and bruised, maybe reputationally and whatnot. But I was very, very lucky in that I got an opportunity to work for actually a healthy bank, which was rare at the time because most of the banks were still reeling from the crisis of, again, 2008, 2009. So MUFG was a healthy bank, so healthy that it was able to invest $9 billion or so into Morgan Stanley during the crisis to sort of shore up their balance sheet. And, for us, it was a time of trying to be aggressive in markets and in opportunities that the rest of the banks had to be a little bit more cautious. So it was really cool. Like I was working on, mega cap M&A deals, front page of the paper type transactions, many of them in partnership with our Morgan Stanley joint venture. And that was a pretty neat thing, at least at the very beginning, to be involved in interesting deals with big companies that, I was familiar with, not just because of coverage, but because like they're very big and interesting and important companies. So that was really awesome. And I think what was also interesting is that MUFG, again, is a Japanese bank with offices all around the world. But what that meant was it had a very different culture internally than what you would typically see in Western organizations. A little bit more conservative, a little bit more methodical, much more consensus-based decision-making. And that varied at the different offices around the world, but it was just an interesting kind of exposure, experience of exposure to different cultures and being part of an interesting growing organization.
I mean, it sounds like an amazing place to begin work and objectively, especially given the time, but even now today, working at an organization like that is what many people would think of as like a plum job. It is something that is just a job that many people would go to great lengths to land for themselves. So at what point did that veneer sort of wear off? At what point did you start thinking about moving on to something else?
Yeah, look, I think as with the beginning of your sort of first job, you kind of have kind of wide eyes and bushy tails or what have you in terms of the possibilities. And as you said, it was a highly coveted job and the kind of thing that I think was ultimately the product of what I was working towards. And so all that was really great and encouraging. But I would say it was kind of like baptism by fire in a way. because you hear all the myths and folklore about banking and how much, the hours and the grunt work and all this stuff, but you can't really understand it until you do it and get to experience not just that, but also just like all the things around it and starting to kind of peel back, look at the broader system and, obviously getting more familiar with the people you're working with, the kind of transactions you're working on, all that kind of stuff takes a little bit of time to kind of settle in and broaden your perspective, or at least help you establish a perspective on why actually, you're doing a certain thing and whether or not it aligns with what you want. So I would say about a year and a half or so into my time as an analyst, I started to question a lot of my previous assumptions and the track I was on. And I just felt like I was working really hard and was getting a little bit burnt out and maybe a bit jaded about the experience in a way. And there were a lot of things that contributed to that, but I think some of it was just the classic work-life balance and working like in many cases the entire weekend or all-nighters. And I think I had many over the years, but especially around this time, a deal that I'd been working on all week, maybe 90 hours in the week or more. And I'd worked all weekend and then it fell apart. And it just felt so thankless and kind of pointless that I'd sacrificed, all these things during the week, whether it was dinner with friends or, going to the gym or whatever else that I might have wanted to do, even sitting down and reading a book at a decent hour. And I didn't really have anything to show at the end of that, period of time, or however compressed it was. And as I said, that wasn't the only time it happened. So I think it was just me starting to connect the dots. Like, what is the point of all this? Like, there's a lot of good in that work. And I don't want to make it sound like it was all kind of like soulless work. That's not true. I learned an enormous amount, and the people who mentored me and the relationships I developed were tremendous. But I felt like for me, it just didn't get me energized in my gut, like to get up every day and work that hard for what I felt at the time was like someone else's dream, someone else's machine that I was just stepping into. And the proverbial rat race was something that just felt front and center for me. Like, I'm in that, and now I have a choice to kind of be aware of it and do something about it or not. And that this is around the time that happened.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I can imagine that sort of feeling. I myself was in the secondary markets, and so it was much more kind of like you just keep on rowing the boat forward type of thing. It's not as project based or like a long arc type of thing, but I can imagine how that would just really underscore the nature of what your time is actually producing. If you're really throwing in a 90-hour week, like, you may have seen me wince when you said that, because that's just brutal. That's 2 jobs plus. But to do that and then not be able to see anything come out of the other side is tough. And that's a lot of careers have that kind of like variance proposition where not everything you're doing is necessarily going to pay out. But I would imagine that the idea that when it does pay out, that it pays out in a way that's meaningful is a big part of the what you're pursuing and what your ultimate pursuit was. I mean, I know the end of the story in the sense, well, not the end of the story, but where the story has gotten to by this point. And I'd love to kind of jump into one of the things that really set you apart when I was first getting to know you, which was the fact that I think it was after the first time we chatted, you shared a letter that you had written to your parents a few years into investment banking, maybe a couple of, you'll have to refresh me, but it was a very, very pointed letter outlining what you had learned from your time there and what you wanted the rest of your life to be like. And there's just a high degree of accountability that goes along with, proverbially putting pen to paper. So I would love to, I'd love to have you read that, or the edited version of it for our audience. Cause I think, I was looking through it, and it's just, every paragraph is kind of necessary to the whole thing. I was looking at it like, do we want to do excerpts? Do we want to do things like this? And the whole thing just wound up being, in my opinion, gold. So if you'd like to share that with us, I'd love to give you an opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy, and I appreciate the kind words. And yeah, I think, for me, before I jump into it, I think it was very helpful for me to kind of clarify my thoughts, and as you said, share those thoughts with other people who could help me not just validate them, but hold me accountable to some of the ideas and thoughts that I bring up in this note. So this letter I'm about to read, I wrote in the spring of 2012. So again, about 2 years into my what is usually a 3-year analyst program. So right sort of in the middle of it. And it was after kind of a really long week of another one of those kind of broken deals and, a heavy workload that just didn't feel all that great. So Sunday night, but prior to starting the week, I wrote this note to my parents. So here we go. Dear Mom and Dad, over the past weeks, I've been hinting that this note was coming your way. Let's call it a sequel to part 1 I wrote when I first moved to New York to begin my career. It's going to be deep, so bear with me. These past 2 years have taught me much about what I want in life and how I will get it. The greatest blessing about my current job, slogging through super long days with barely enough time to come up for air, is that it was an extreme. Extreme situations, I found, can teach lessons and arrange behavioral patterns in 1/10 the time it takes more moderate circumstances, if you are conscious enough to notice and brave enough to change. I think becoming familiar with an extreme in any form can enforce blindness and unconsciousness to even the simple, rather obvious fact that you're living through an uncomfortable, unhealthy extreme. It happens with people dealing with drugs, rock star lifestyles, bad relationships, workaholics, the unloyal, the faithless, the soulless, many of the people I've been encountering. I'm so fortunate that I've noticed rather quickly that I don't love what I'm doing or the circumstance in which I'm doing it. I don't wake up excited to work like this for someone else's dream, the dream of a big corporate or social machine I didn't intentionally create for myself. I want to wake up and live my truth, to be the creator and master of my dream right now. I realize I don't even take pride in telling people what I do. Wouldn't it be awesome to get jazzed up anytime someone asks you what you do or did or love or loved? While helpful and necessary, investment banking is an industry marred by selfish pursuits and more than a fair share of lost, unconscious people. I'm finding it discouraging that so many of the talented people around me can work so hard to serve principally themselves in the steadfast pursuit of their yearly reward, the almighty bonus. Ironically, one might think that at least on the day we are paid, we would be pretty satisfied with the reward for all the hard work and sacrifice. But the truth is, even for that single day, most people, myself included, find that the number is not quite enough to be worthy of true contentment. Consequently, for the better part of the year, many people in the rat race elect to chase their tail, trying to prove their worth, climb the so-called corporate ladder, get that promotion, buy that ring, and acquire that smile. I don't think it takes a whole lot of wisdom to know that if you don't want the destination inherent to the path you're on, then it's time to get out while you still can. Pretty soon, I suspect, the money gets too good, the mortgage gets too big, and the golden handcuffs form an unyielding grip. Many people with a singular focus on money become too cold for genuine human interaction. They seem to be living someone else's dream, the collective world's dream, which, if you've read the headlines, is wrought by malice and defined by almost universal misguidance about what life is all about. What I'm getting at here is I've seen the light. I've looked inward deep enough to know that a fancy car and mansion are not what I'm after, at least not at the cost of my soul. Materials can afford certain freedom in this world, but their luster is never quite good enough for people who define their worth through them. I am privileged and grateful to have grown up in the good life. Both of you have afforded me outstandingly rare opportunities that I don't take for granted. But I've concluded that pursuing only personal gains and status as quickly as possible is not the only way to live. I'm confident I can earn a living while simultaneously living. However, I realize that other issues do come with less financial security and flexibility. I sense that if I follow my heart and interest going forward, like Dad did when he left a good-paying job in Buffalo for a so-called foolish gig at Embry-Riddle, things will work out for me. The universe is a peculiar way of letting the pieces fall into place for those who take leaps of faith and trust in themselves. It has been faithful to me so far. If Dad had believed what everyone else said, including good faith warnings and condemnations, he could be in Buffalo managing a post office right now. But he trusted his instinct, heart, and dream with resolve and determination. Most successful people, which undoubtedly includes selfless mothers that raise nice boys and girls, have a similar story. Most fools do not. My heart tells me I wasn't born to crunch numbers or chase money and validation. I think I can use my stellar education, professional skills, and entrepreneurial ambitions to make a difference in this world. If I can find work with more reasonable demands on my time, I will be able to do the many things, big and small, that I haven't had the time or space to do. For example, I want to give back to my community, read all the books I haven't had time to touch, and possibly start my own business. I want to have time to play pickup basketball, meet great people, help the disadvantaged, watch the sunset, own a dog, learn to rock climb, smell the roses, reflect, be thankful, and so forth. My next job, which I hope to find by the end of this summer or early fall, will be pursuing something more creative that interacts with, supports, and helps people in some way or another. I have an extremely marketable skill set that I can bring to any interview for many kinds of institutions. What I have in mind is working for a mission-driven organization like the World Bank, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a global micro-lending enterprise, or perhaps an urban revitalization project. Don't worry, I'm not talking about going rogue and selling hemp keychains in Jamaica. I still think I can earn a decent salary doing something more agreeable to my values, skills, and interests. And I don't plan on quitting my current gig until I secure that job. I fully recognize that I'm extremely lucky to be considering other possibilities right now. Many of my peers are saddled with student loans or other limiting circumstances. The fact that I can even think about leaving such a high-paying job is a gift you both gave me. Although I might not be able to spend as much money as now, I will make the adjustments and figure it out. Up until now, you have both guided me from one stage to the next, and it's a bit scary and unfamiliar to think about the next unknown stage being entirely my own. With a 360-degree view, I can now jump any which way I choose. So now, just as a child learning to ride a bike, my training wheels are ready to come off, and I'll be just fine when you let go of my back. It's time to take the handlebars for myself, and I've got a pretty snazzy bike to check out the neighborhood. And that concludes my thoughts. Have a nice day. Love, Pat.
First of all, Patrick, wow. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's something that this audience is going to find really useful and really helpful in letting people know that they're not alone in having these feelings. When I saw this, there was so much within it that stood out to me as like, oh, that's familiar. That's exactly kind of the emotional cocktail that was going through my head at a similar stage in my career. And so this is something that I think has a lot more universality to it. And yet, we kind of go through it alone in many cases, and we have to confide in the people that we're closest to. Like you wrote this to your mom and dad, and you're lucky to have parents that were receptive and available emotionally and support wise for that type of thing. Because many people don't necessarily have that luxury, but having that connection within your life is massive. So anyways, before I go prattling on, thank you for sharing that. And there's a ton of stuff that I'm going to want to unpack with you in there. But right off the bat, I think there's one line that stood out to me just as you were just reading this right now. And that was that the universe has a peculiar way of letting the pieces fall into place for those who take leaps of faith and trust in themselves. How did you have the stones to have that feeling, that sense, at that early stage in your career? That's something that I felt like it took me a long time to even realize. Like, it's a very recent type of idea that's even cropped up in my head. So where did that sense come from for you?
As you say that back to me, it's interesting because I don't know why I felt that way, to be honest. I mean, I could probably point to a few things, but I think a lot of it was based on the limited kind of worldly experience I had, seeing people like my dad do what I was describing, which is take a leap of faith and then see what happens. And for him and for our family, that worked out amazing. And it was, I think, an example of that. But I think beyond the kind of career points, I just started to believe in how many of the dots behind me could be connected because of trusting myself in some way or another. And they could be big or small. Little decisions about what sport you're going to play or not, what school you're going to go to or not, what friend you're going to be with or not, when you're going to stop hanging out with certain people because you get the feeling that maybe it's time to move on. Like that. So that all was, I think, informing that point. And I think this was hammered home by a book I was reading at the time. And I vividly remember the book and how I felt when I read it. And I think this point came through. And the book was The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And I just remember reading it and feeling like, wow, there is so much wisdom in here about how much more powerful, we are than we know, and how much our kind of our thinking sometimes and our conditioning and other things get in the way of letting the universe, help us become who we're meant to be. And so I started to trust in that, and it really just hit me when I was reading that book that there's all this kind of mirage or charade in life, in society and culture and corporations, and many people just like sign up to be programmed, or maybe they don't sign up, but they're just sort of conditioned in a certain way. But if they would just step back and let the universe help them and stay true to what they really want, I felt like that was something that just resonated. And so I felt the need to write it.
I love that. You saw me smile as you were saying that, because I don't think that book has come up in our prior conversations. And yet it was one that was pivotal for me as well. In fact, I think the second time that I read it, I was literally on a Goldman trading floor, at the kind of like business continuity office, where I was like the only person on the poorly climate regulated floor. And so I was just, kind of like making sure that everything worked. So anyways, that book, I think, does an amazing job. I think it's definitely like when the student is ready, the teacher appears type of thing. In fact, I remember, it having such a profound impact on me that my wife noticed it. And I remember a couple of years later when I was feeling or acting less enlightened, my wife nudging me and saying like, "Hey, do you want to read that book again?" And so it's, I can vouch for its power in moving things along. There's a ton in there. Another thing that I want to touch on with you is writing an email like this. And you were very good about just pointing to the fact that it's a product of its time in your life, right? Writing an email like this entails this cocktail of emotions that you're subject to. And by the way, not everybody writes off a 1,200 word email to their parents on a Sunday night when they're, working 90-hour weeks. So what made it so that you were like, okay, it's time to sit down and actually think about this and structure my thoughts in a coherent way?
It's a great question. I think, one of the, I guess, coping mechanisms or strategies I've always used in my life to clarify my thinking and to communicate my thinking is to write. So I've always enjoyed writing. I get a lot of joy out of the process, but I think the outcome of it can be just, it helps you see in black and white like what you're thinking, and that gives you some distance from it, and it helps you get to sort of the truth of what you're trying to say, hopefully. And then by sharing it, you can get people to like poke and prod at it maybe and help you question assumptions and whatnot. But I think maybe prior to that time, this was not like a draft sort of sitting around and I was toying with it for weeks or months. It was like, I wrote this in 25 minutes on a Sunday evening, before I went to bed. Because I think the ideas and the emotions that I was sitting with for that week, and then probably the months prior, were so consistent that I started to feel like this wasn't like a one-off kind of bad week. It was like, I need to like acknowledge these feelings and thoughts in writing. Maybe people will tell me I'm crazy. Why don't I start with my parents and just see what they think? And that was kind of the beginning. And, I am lucky in that I have a very supportive family, and my parents have never like put pressure on me to kind of be or do anything. They've just always sort of trusted I would figure it out. And so their response was like incredibly encouraging. And I think that whole loop of process, which is like writing it down, sharing it, a certain amount of feedback, you get like a kind of either conviction or confidence in what you're saying and validation that it's real. And I think for me, that was like the beginning of the steps that would come later. And so it was super important.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I mean, I'm the same way, that writing something, actually sitting down to make sure my thoughts cohere with one another, and then running it under the nose of other trusted people, that's huge. Just stress testing, because I think for all of us, particularly when we're evaluating potential changes in life, there's this question that's popping up, like, is the whole world crazy or am I crazy, type of thing. And so that, what you did, I think, is the first step towards answering that question. Am I just nuts to, turn my nose up at what is an amazing job that most people would kill to have? Or is this, is this a fault with me, or is it a fault with the way the system's set up? So tell me a little bit about what the schedule of events afterwards. How long did it take you after writing this to actually move on to your next step? And what was that to do?
Yeah, so I wish I could tell you this kind of grand plan or manifesto somehow had exact, timelines that were, just a couple months away in terms of making transition, but that didn't quite happen. So this was the beginning of a process in which I started to broaden my mind about what the next steps could be and should be for me. So a lot of people in investment banking or finance in general step into these like analyst programs that are typically 3 years. And then after 3 years, it's very common for people to go get their MBA. They go to the buy side and join like a private equity shop or venture capital. Some of them go to big corporations, and others completely pivot and do other things. But it's a fairly contained list of options that people start considering. And so even though I wrote this letter, I didn't pull myself out of at least considering what those things were. Wasn't super attracted to the MBA route, so I didn't pursue that. But I was interviewing for opportunities that were outside the bank and still in finance, and nothing just felt quite right. And so I didn't make a decision for a little while. But coming up at the end of my second year, basically I got an opportunity. Actually, really at the beginning of my third year, I got an opportunity from my boss and my boss's boss to stay with the bank and to actually move to the London office and help build out the M&A platform that we were building in New York, and sort of duplicate that in London, and then potentially go on around the world after that and be someone that's sort of jumping around, connecting dots. So I left at that. It was a 1 year stint, a 1 year commitment anyway. I moved to London, absolutely loved a lot of it. But, I would say about a year or so in, my learning curve started to top out. I started to get a little bit antsy about what comes next. During this time, I hired a career coach. I started doing a lot of this kind of letter writing, again, maybe just to myself, or at least like workshopping kind of, actually, I've got to make some decisions here. I was then offered a full-time position in London and accepted it, mostly because I didn't know what I was going to do, and I just wasn't ready to jump yet. But during this time, I was aggressively turning up how actively I was going to be talking to different people in my network, friends, colleagues that were doing different things. So just starting to interview sounds more formal, but just have conversations with people that were entrepreneurs, that were working in the technology industry, were working in nonprofits. Like, just wanted to kind of explore things. And as luck would have it, someone that I went to high school with, who I didn't know all that well, contacted me at that exact time when I was going through this process. And he basically told me that he had just started a company out in LA that was called Bondit Media Capital, and it was built as a specialty finance company for the film and entertainment industry. and he needed a CFO. And so I initially started working with him on the side to just kind of do some consulting, kind of late at night or what have you. And it wasn't long before he offered me, the full-time job to move out to LA, be the CFO and kind of part of the founding team of both Bondit, and then we had a sister company called Buffalo 8. So I put in my 2 weeks notice in London, went back to New York, loaded up my mom's Suburban, and drove out to Los Angeles. And I've been out here for the last 7 years as an entrepreneur.
Got it. I mean, there are a couple things that strike me about that. I think one, it's a deliberate process, right? Like I heard that, as much as I'd like to say that I moved on right away, this is just planting the seed. Just like putting that pen to paper was just forming an intention. And then, you went on with several more stages with your current employer until you found the right place to jump. It's not a reckless, like, that's it, I'm out of here type of thing. It's like, okay, something's off here. I want to move on to something that makes better sense for who I am. And then just putting out those feelers, having those conversations, being willing to field a call from some, it sounds like a connection from high school that you didn't know all that well. For me, when I was at my time at Goldman, forming connections with random people from high school was not something that I was allocating much time to. And so putting yourself in a spot where you were able and open to receive that sort of opportunity, I think is a big part of it. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about, you mentioned getting to the end of the learning curve. I think that's a recurring theme among people who wind up moving on to something else. Talk to me about what it felt like to get to the end of that learning curve and realize that you weren't learning as quickly as before.
Yeah. I do want to mention one quick thing I neglected to answer on the last point, which we can touch on later if we want to. But basically, during that time of working with the coach and talking to a lot of colleagues and stuff, I did put a date on my calendar about 4 months out for December 1st, 2014 would be the day that I would either jump and move on, stay and intentionally stay, or otherwise, let myself down for not making a decision, basically. So, but the reason I wanted to mention that is because that is the exact day that I couldn't have known in advance was going to happen, that I put in my 2 weeks notice. So this connects to your earlier question about the universe having peculiar ways of letting pieces fall into place. I think this was an example of that. Like you couldn't have. Yeah. I'm not someone who really does that kind of thing, but it was the kind of believing and manifesting almost what you want, and this is kind of what happened. So to your question about learning curve topping out, I think it became like I love learning. I love learning. I love like getting skilled at something new and trying to get better and better, and that whole experience of like, proficiency and excellence and all that stuff is great, particularly when you're still learning. But I think at a certain point, I felt like I was just kind of going through the motions because there was no more like new stuff. Like the characters were different, the numbers were different, but it was essentially all the same thing. And I just felt like, okay, maybe there's not that much more to this. I think if I'd stayed longer, maybe it would have moved more towards like managing people versus like output of, as an associate, it's like analysis and a lot of kind of like grunt work and whatnot, but in process management, all this stuff. But for me, in the time I was in, it just felt like I'm going to have to put forward another number of years doing the same type of work without a huge gain and learning. That just didn't feel great. And as I started talking to mentors and coaches and other people about what I was thinking about, like the learning curve was something that I kept bringing up and they kept sort of pointing to as an example for when it is time to move on. Like that is one of the most important things in your career is to learn, especially when you're early in your career. And it just felt like whatever comes next has to be additive to my skills, my experiences, and not just kind of going through motions. So I think that's how I'd answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that resonates very strongly with me because if you don't answer that call, if you don't scratch that itch of like, hey, it's time to learn something, then you start to become complacent, and then it becomes scarier and more insecure about, hey, can I still learn new things? Is that still something that's within my wheelhouse? Because it's like a muscle, like everything else. And I love that you led with, I love to learn, because that, I think, is the orientation that is just ultimately necessary for where you eventually wound up. And so I know, now you're an entrepreneur, you use that bridge to move on to the next phase, and then wound up parlaying it into your current role. But that willingness and appetite to learn is just table stakes for entrepreneurship. It is the essence of entrepreneurship. You're just trying to learn as quickly as possible. You're trying to embrace the fact that the only thing you know about your projections is that they're wrong, and it's your job to figure out how they're wrong, remedy it, and form something that can continue to achieve the mission. So tell me what you're up to now with your startup.
Yeah. So, I agree with everything you just said. And I think what's amazing about being an entrepreneur is you learn so many. I mean, I think it's like, it feels like you learn 100 years of wisdom and maybe like 1 year of being an entrepreneur. And before I get into what I'm up to now, I'll just say, like, for me, the understanding that if things didn't work out with whatever I did next, in some kind of outcome oriented way. So let's say it's like a result of building a company worth X, or having some kind of validation of why, like, that's one thing. And I kind of pushed that to the side. And for me, it was like, focused on the learning, because even if it goes wrong, and this was some of the best advice I got during that time when I was thinking about the jump, was even if it goes wrong, you can lean on that, because that's fascinating. Most people don't have that experience to try to start something from nothing and, learn the 1,000,001 skills that, and sort of experiences that come with being an entrepreneur. So anyway, that's the point on that. And in terms of what I'm up to now, I think, so I built my last two companies, again, under the one umbrella, together for about 4.5 years. It was an incredible journey. We raised, a lot of money. We built a market leading company. We then sold it to a Canadian public company, which I then worked under for like 1.5 years. It wasn't long before I started to get antsy again about wanting to do the next thing. And so I peeled off in early 2019 and started a company called Owl Ridge Group, which was formed for really two purposes. The first was I wanted to provide support as a CFO and kind of like hybrid COO was my skill set, to other early stage companies, entrepreneurs, and also growth stage companies. And I wanted to just get in the mix of other things, maybe outside of like financial services, and be of service to this community that I grew to love. So that was part of it. And then the second part was I wanted to incubate ideas that could become companies, or they could become their own sort of separate projects that I was just interested in and I felt a connection to. So during 2019, one of my early clients in Owl Ridge Group decided to, we sort of mutually decided to partner up with one of those ideas for starting a company in the pet food space. And we created a company called Pallaby, which was and is a direct-to-consumer pet food company, which focuses on mass customization of pet food to keep pets healthy based on their changing needs. So again, it's like I had no experience in pet food, no experience in CPG, basically no experience in e-commerce. But the idea was interesting enough. And the more I dug into it and realized the problem of unhealthy pets and my love for pets, that gave me a great connection to the mission of what we were trying to do, that got me jazzed up to try this, to really just start putting one foot in front of the other to build an entirely new company based on an idea. So that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years, and we're still running the company now. And in this very moment, I'm now taking a little bit of time to kind of take a step back, think deeply about what I want to do next and, what's getting me excited. I think there's just so much interesting innovation happening. And there's also still an awful lot of unsolved problems that I want to at least have an eye on and just see what comes up next. So it's kind of an exploration period for me. And I continue to love working with entrepreneurs and startups, coaching and advising and investing, because I just think it's incredibly rewarding to support people like me that are on a similar path of trying to build things and trying to kind of make their dreams come true, which is an awesome place to be.
Right. I think that resonates very strongly. I mean, solving a real problem, because that's when you create something. And I know we've spoken about this a little bit before, but when you create something that is actually making somebody better off, is actually making someone happier, in your case, because their pet was obese and then wound up getting healthy again, or, you can just see the extra spring in their step because they're putting decent things into their body. Like when you're solving a real problem, going from the pinnacle of abstraction, manipulating symbols in a spreadsheet or that type of thing, to now plugging into solving a real and tangible problem. I think people don't realize that those skills can be parlayed from one to the next and to the next. Mm-hmm. And that jumping it's a serial process. It's not something where it's just like, well, left Mitsubishi and now I'm off to my next thing and happily ever after. It's something that you need to continue and just keep your head on a swivel, because who you are right now is different from who you were when you wrote that letter 10 years ago,
totally.
Or who you will be 10 years from now. And so I think it's cool to hear you embracing that. I know we're coming up on our allotted time here. I've got another question for you just to wrap things up. What advice would you give someone who's feeling that initial wave of discontentment that drove you to write that letter in the first place?
Yeah, well, look, I think the first thing is sort of recognizing you're not alone, having those thoughts. And like we said at the beginning, like when you get these highly coveted positions at, well-regarded, big, safe, in many cases, well-paying institutions, to basically potentially turn your back on that sometimes feels foolish. But I think what's important is to realize that you're having the thoughts and feelings for a reason. And so for me, it's like, as I said, there are times when those things come up and they're one-off. You had a bad week or a bad month. But if you've had like 6 months in a row or that's just a random number, but if it's some period of time where the thoughts and feelings are consistent, my advice would be to pay attention to it. And then I have basically two recommendations for what to do next, practical, hopefully. The first is to write it down. Write down, doesn't have to be a letter to your parents or really anyone, but just write it down. Maybe let it sit, come back to it, annotate how it might change over time. And that's one idea for sort of clarifying your thoughts and solidifying them. The second, which is incredibly useful to me, it's been incredibly useful to me, is to get a coach or at least a mentor who you really trust and respect. Maybe someone who's been there and done that, someone with many years more experience. I think whether it's a life coach, career coach, executive coach, I've had them all, and I think they've all added something to my perspective. And the best ones will challenge you. The best ones will read something like this and then try to dig into actually what the values that you're expressing are, so that maybe the decisions you make thereafter are truly aligned instead of just like a whiplash type reaction. And I just find that immensely valuable. So don't keep it all in your head. And I think the last thing is really just like, if you have an urge to maybe do something different, whether it's an entrepreneurial path or not, I encourage you to try, because I honestly don't know anyone who's made that leap that regrets it or landed flat on their face and is somehow destitute, which was part of my fear probably for most of my pre-jump time. It doesn't work out like that. And so the world needs smart, ambitious, curious, creative people to lean in and to help both our small community and larger community across like millions of different problems that come up. And so the more people we can get to kind of lean into stepping out, I think the better. And I'm always happy to be a resource to anyone out there who might want to chat about these kind of moments.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And so you heard it first here, people. Write it down, get a coach, and then just get out there and give it a shot. I think those are amazing words of wisdom from somebody who's actually done it. So thank you so much, Patrick. And I'm looking forward to the next time we catch up.
Likewise. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it.